Oh, you mentioned, the water getting muddy when we have a big runoff event from rain or something like that. I'm sure we've all seen clear water get muddy after we've had a big rain. Do you know, in the Great Plains, what do we call it when we have one of those great big rains and get a big runoff event?
Well, I don't know what you're looking for. I'd call it a gully washer, but I don't know. What would you call it?
Well, gully washer's the term that I heard a lot when I was growing up, but living here in the Flint Hills, we hear toad strangler a lot.
Yeah.
That's one of my favorite things to say.
I've heard that too, yeah.
Welcome to Fins, Fur, and Feathers, the Fish and Wildlife Management podcast at K-State Research and Extension. I'm Dr. Drew Ricketts.
And I'm Dr. Joe Gergen. We're both lifelong hunters and anglers, and K-State Research and Extension specialists who help citizens with their fish, wildlife, and pond management needs. If you've ever had a wildlife or pond management challenge, then this is the podcast for you.
We address common fish and wildlife management problems using a scientific approach to provide proven and practical solutions to the issues that you may be facing. Well, welcome back to Fins, Fur, and Feathers. I think we've got an aquatics episode up this week. Joe, what do you got for us to talk about?
Yeah, we're going to chat today about water clarity. And so we look out at ponds a lot of times. I talk about how I'm a duck hunter and I'm a fisherman. I like dirty ponds and ponds that might not be the quote-unquote perfect-looking pond. But I want to talk a little bit about water clarity and what really we want, what goes into that, and why it's important to think about for pond management.
Sure. So I guess what is clarity? What's that term referring to when we're talking about a pond?
Sure. So when we think about, pond management or water clarity, when you get a glass of water out of a tap, that's mostly water. There's a few things that we like to add into it. Our government does generally to help us be healthy. But when we think about water itself, we tend to think about it being really clear.
Sure.
When we go out to a pond, it might be, a lot more muddy, or turbid would be the word that we use for that. And so what we're talking about with water clarity is how far can light shine down into that water column, and that's going to affect a lot of different things that go on in that pond. And so a lot of people think that they want their water to look like that crystal clear, like what comes out of a fountain, and that may be okay, and it might not be.
Sure. The pretty clear water, or I said it kind of backwards there, but what I was trying to say was a lot of people sort of relate pretty water with clear water.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and down south, there's in certain places in Kansas, there's a lot of really clear spring-fed ponds that have that really clear water. But I think that pretty and clear go together for a lot of people, but that doesn't always have to be the case.
Sure. So thinking about dirty water or muddy water versus clear water, that's kind of a subjective way of talking about it. So is there an objective way that we might measure how clear water is?
So we like to use something called a Secchi disc, and a Secchi disc is basically just a circle that's cut up into 4 little quadrants, and they are alternating white and black colors. And so you put that on the end of a rope, and you lower that disc down into the water until you can't see it anymore. And that area where you can't see that disc anymore, that depth would be the Secchi depth, or the depth where you lose that sight line. And so you'd measure that in inches. How deep is it? Generally, it's inches. If you have really, really clear water, you might change that up, but we're looking at inches. Our desired Secchi depth is somewhere around 20 inches, okay? And so we want to get about 20 inches deep and be able to lose clarity. You can think about that with your hand, too. It's not going to be as scientific, but if you put your hand 20 inches underwater, you would want to start losing sight of it for this quote-unquote ideal clarity level. And that's going to be kind of indicative of, we're allowing some sunlight into that pond, and that's important for some reasons. But we're not having it so clear that we run into some other issues like excessive plant growth and things like that. So trying to maintain kind of that 18 to 24 inches, 20 inches is a great kind of target. Some of the things to remember is that, this is going to change daily. It's going to change from morning to evening. It's going to change if a cloud passes by. So thinking about the conditions and don't get caught up. If it's 18, if it's 22, that's all okay.
Sure. So if somebody wanted to measure the Secchi depth of their pond,
Yeah.
Where would they find one of these things?
Yeah. So, I mean, going to some sort of scientific store is mostly what you would do. And so thinking about distributors, sometimes big stores, big recreational type stores would have a Secchi disc, but mostly you'd probably order one of these things. You could also make one. I've seen people make them. You just take some sort of flat piece of plastic and basically color out opposite quadrants in black and leave the other two white. And so it kind of just depends on what you want to do and how deep you want to get into the scientific process of it.
Sure, that's cool. It's not something we're going to go to the dollar store and get to.
No, you're probably not going to find it at your local dollar store. Probably won't be inside of a Happy Meal. You might have to do a little searching for it, but they're out there.
Yeah, cool. So I don't want to belabor this point, but if somebody was going to Google one of those, how would they spell Secchi?
Secchi, Secchi. That's probably an important thing. Secchi is a Secchi disc.
Cool. So why do we care about water clarity? We want to have a pond that's pleasing when we look at it, but why does water clarity matter if we're thinking about pond management?
Sure. Well, two different things. A lot of our listeners are agricultural producers, right? And so thinking about water clarity, that's going to be indicative of the water quality. So they do go hand in hand to some degree, and kind of understanding the clarity as it pertains to either irrigation or, having livestock that are ingesting it, drinking from it. So there's going to be some things there that we want to think about. Thinking about other critters, so fish that are growing. If you don't have enough water clarity, the fish are not going to be able to see their prey. And so you're going to have issues with fish growing and the population doing okay. And the opposite of that's true too. If you have too much water clarity, you might have too many plants that can cause fluctuations in dissolved oxygen levels, for example. And so understanding what goes into the water clarity and is kind of important. One of the important things to remember with clarity is that turbidity that I mentioned earlier, right? And that turbidity is what's decreasing water clarity. And a couple things that, there are a lot of things that can contribute to that. Basically, anything that's floating around in that water is going to increase the turbidity. A lot of what we're thinking about, generally we think about muddiness, right? And so suspended clay, suspended particles. If you go shove a fire hose on the side of a mud flat, for example, all of that mud's going to get washed up, and that's what happens during a big rain. So you get a lot of sediment washed into different waterways, and that's turbidity. You can have things like phytoplankton, so little single-celled plants that are growing, algae cells that are growing in the water column. Those phytoplankton are really important for small fish that are growing up. And so, those differences in what's creating that turbidity is also important. But those things are important for the fish growing and just overall, habitat, overall ecology for your pond.
Very cool. Well, you mentioned, the water getting muddy when we have a big runoff event from rain or something like that. I'm sure we've all seen clear water get muddy after we've had a big rain. Do you know in the Great Plains, what do we call it when we have one of those great big rains and get a big runoff event?
Well, I don't know what you're looking for. I'd call it a gully washer, but I don't know. What would you call it?
Well, gully washer's the term that I heard a lot when I was growing up, but living here in the Flint Hills, we hear toad strangler a lot.
Yeah.
That's one of my favorite things to say.
I've heard that too, yeah. A nice toad strangler. So, those come through and there's a lot of good in them, but they're also, they can cause hopefully lots of stuff to wash in, hopefully not too many toads washing into your pond.
Sure. The pretty pond is good, but what happens if we don't have enough suspended solids or phytoplankton and that kind of stuff in the pond? What happens if it's too clear?
Yeah, and so it can be a good thing to have clear water. And, thinking about just the aesthetics, that might be a benefit. If you're using it primarily for swimming, you might want it to be a little more clear. Clear doesn't always mean that it's better water quality, though, right? And so it doesn't mean it's safer to swim in or anything like that. But some of the things that happen if it gets too clear is that you get a lot of plant growth, a lot of large plant growth, and that can tend to take over the pond itself. One of the issues that you have with that, when you have a lot of plant growth, you can have issues where oxygen is produced during the day, but then it's utilized at night. And so you can have big fluctuations in your oxygen levels, and that can lead to issues like fish kills where, you have so many plants that are keeping oxygen levels high, but because of that fluctuation during the night, those oxygen levels get low enough that you could have fish kills. We talked a little bit about how, the fish are feeding on those phytoplankton, and so, not having enough suspended that there are any nutrients or that they're able to utilize, those different nutrients to grow could be, another issue where we're cutting back everything from that pond. And so the primary productivity in that pond crashes, and then you have catastrophic effects throughout the food web. So if you want to maintain good ecology in your pond, having some suspended particles is really important.
Sure. Well, you mentioned that clear water doesn't necessarily mean that it's clean water, and that too clear can lead to lots of weed growth. Thinking about growing up down in southeast Kansas, I learned how to fish in the strip pits. So old coal mines that have filled back up with water, and I mean, those things have some of the clearest water I've ever seen and ever fished in.
Yep.
But there's definitely some heavy metal contamination and stuff like that that's hiding in there. And a lot of those pits, especially if you're out there at night shining a light down in that water, you can see the bottom just like it was 3 or 4 inches deep, but you're looking down through 15, 20 feet of water.
Yeah.
And the weed growth in there is just incredible.
Yeah, it's crazy. That light can penetrate. We've talked in the past about how most of the plants that grow in water systems are growing on the bottom of that pond. And so if water can get to the bottom 15, 20 feet down, you're going to have plants that are that deep, and that can cause issues where you get too many plants, right?
Yeah.
So talking about that and thinking about that's something that you want to keep in mind.
So you've mentioned fish growth issues, both when you were talking about not having enough phytoplankton in the water because it's too clear, but I think you were also hinting at fish growth issues a little bit when we were talking about having really turbid water. So kind of explain how that might work.
Sure, and that's where that 20-inch kind of value tends to come in. So if that would get down to 10 inches or so, it'd be hard for fish to be able to see prey swimming by. And so fish like largemouth bass are primarily sight feeders. Fish have something on the side of them called a lateral line, and that lateral line kind of helps them to feel movement in the water and prey and things like that. But a lot of fish can use that to feed, and others can't. And so fish like largemouth bass need to be able to see a prey item, identify it, and then strike at that fish. And so if the predators can't see something in front of them, they're not going to be able to feed as well, right? And so that's probably the biggest issue when you get too much turbidity, issues like that, where you're going to decrease that vision, that line of sight, and then decrease the amount that they can feed or the effectiveness how they can feed, and that can cause declines in your fish population or your relative weights. Relative conditions is all that stuff's important. So too much water clarity isn't great. Too little is not great. So kind of finding that balance. Talk about balance a lot on this podcast,
Yeah.
But balance is something that we need to strive for.
No, that makes sense. When you were talking about predators finding prey, that made me think about something. So when we're fishing or sampling fish in different clarities of water, one of the things that I've always found really interesting is, if we're in really clear water, the color patterns on the fish are really bright, right? They're the black on a bass is very pronounced, and lots of contrast. But when it gets muddy, then they're all sort of washed out and pale. So why does that happen?
Yeah, so we used to, when I used to do some research in caves, and so we'd catch fish that had washed in from the surface down in the caves, and they were just pale as could be. And we didn't want them down there because they could eat some of the fish that we were trying to save and preserve. And so we would take them back to the surface, and they would just brighten up. So a very similar thing. And so a lot of fish have what are called melanophores on them, and melanophores are just changes in the pigment. And so they're not necessarily changing their color, but if you kind of think about it as like an opening, right? And so when they're really, really pale, these melanophores are kind of closed. And when they're really, really bright colors, they kind of open them up like a peacock tail, right? So keep them folded up. They're not as bright. and brighter conditions, they can kind of color up. So those melanophores help them to change colors, and mostly what they're doing is trying to blend in. So when we're looking at them on the surface, obviously they look brightly colored, but when they're in their habitat, they're generally trying to blend in, unless they're a male during breeding season and they're trying to find a girl so they can reproduce. So that's generally those melanophores are really cool, and you can definitely see those changes in the color. One of the things I like to point out to people, I think it's fun, is that one of the wavelengths that can penetrate deepest into water is the color red. And so when we think about catching fish that live deep, like red snapper, or there are a lot of grouper that are red, that red coloration in those deeper waters is because down when you're that deep, they tend to blend in more with the wavelength of light that's down there. So different wavelengths are penetrating different amounts, all kinds of things that go on when you get to different depths and that are affected by that water clarity.
Very cool. Very cool. So if we could figure out how to put melanophores into people, then we could save a whole lot of money on camouflage.
Yeah, if we could control it, we sure could. That'd be great.
So we've talked a little bit about different things that can affect water clarity. What about fertilizer? Is that something that could affect my clarity in my pond?
Yeah, we've hinted at that before. And so we've talked about fertilizer and the importance of fertilizer. And so, in Kansas, our ponds tend to shut down, around this time of year. Water temperatures generally start to get down in the low 60s, high 50s. We've been extraordinarily hot, or unseasonably hot, unreasonably too, I guess I could say.
Yeah, it's unreasonable as far as I'm concerned.
We've been too hot lately, and so it might be a little while we might be lagging behind. But this time of year the ponds start to slow down, and we kind of have a dormant season. So things are still active, fish are still feeding. You can go ice fishing and catch fish, but the amount of productivity in that pond is vastly slower. And so down south, we've talked about their ponds tend to stay warmer year-round and have more activity. So up here in Kansas, we are generally, because of that lull that we have, we don't ever really run out of nutrients in our pond, right? And so we generally have enough nutrients that we would have phytoplankton blooms and things like that, but there have been 2 cases that I can think of in the time I've been at K-State that I have recommended someone add fertilizer to their pond, and I've looked at hundreds of ponds in my time here. So it's not something that never happens, but before you add fertilizer, make sure you talk to a professional. That can go really, really poorly and then can be very expensive to fix. So not something I generally recommend, and you'd want to make sure that you're protecting your fish. If you add a bunch of fertilizer, that could cause massive eutrophication, big algal blooms, and could lead to something like a fish kill in a matter of days, right? And so definitely talk to a professional before you start thinking about fertilizer.
And eutrophication, what's that mean?
Eutrophication, big word. So eutrophication is excessive nutrients in a pond. We're generally talking about phosphorus and nitrogen. So phosphates and nitrates are generally what we're measuring, different nutrients, and those are generally the limiting factors for different plants to grow in your pond. And so if you add those nutrients in, you tend to get excessive plant growth.
Got it. Cool. So if my pond is, let's say it's too turbid, what can I do about that?
Yeah, and so the first thing would be to make sure it's too turbid, and we're going to use that Secchi disc, or at least use our hand underwater and kind of the same spot, the same time of day, and see how deep you can get. And if you identify that it's too turbid, if you want more water clarity, then you can do things. You can add things to your pond, and 2 of the most common things to add are gypsum and alum. The first thing I would recommend is doing a jar test. And so there are different kinds of jar tests. We've talked about jar tests for cyanobacteria, but this one's for sediment. And so what you want to do is go take a sample of the water and just set it in your garage on a shelf for about 24 hours and come back and look at it and see if there's sediment that's settled on the bottom of your jar or if it's all mixed in. So if there is sediment on the bottom, that is indicative that there's some sort of physical action in your pond keeping things mixed up. And so if we could somehow stop that action, whether that's it could be aeration, it could be some sort of fountain, it could be a stream that's coming in a little bit too turbulent. If you can slow that down a little bit, that can help cut down turbidity. And this might take a few months, but that stuff should precipitate out. If the water still looks murky, evenly distributed, then the next step would be to put a little bit of alum or gypsum into the jar. They sell little containers of alum in the grocery store with the spices, right? And so that's a really good, cheap way to go get a little bit. It does not take much. I mean, you're talking just a tiny little pinch in that jar, and see if that clears it up. The alum and gypsum are positively charged, and most of the floating particles in a pond are negatively charged, so they kind of act like magnets. When they join together, they get too heavy, and so then they precipitate out, they fall out. So those are a couple of the things you can do. Another benefit of gypsum or alum is that they can bind with phosphates and nitrates, so they can kind of reset a pond. But remember, we want some turbidity in our pond, so if you just start adding these things and clear up your pond too much, that can cause issues too. So make sure you understand what's going on before you just go start throwing those things into your pond.
The things that you mentioned that can cause the suspended solids that will go ahead and precipitate out were sort of non-biological things. Are there any biological reasons that we might have suspended solids out in that pond? Yeah,
and so the biggest one, are certain fish species, and so bullheads are notorious for disturbing the sediment. When we start to get too many plants, one of the first things that people rush to are grass carp, right? And so grass carp are a tool. There are times when they may be beneficial, but grass carp do a couple things. One, they tend to grow really big. So grass carp can live like 50 years, right? Pretty long time. And when they start to get big, they swim around and they're just a tail's moving around. A 50-pound fish can create a lot of havoc on the bottom of a pond on that sediment, so they can increase water turbidity. The other thing they tend to do is they really like to eat tender shoots, tender parts of the plant, but they're really picky, so they might take 5 bites and figure out that it's a little too stringy and spit it out, go take something else and keep doing that. And each of those little pieces can regrow.
Sure.
And so grass carp can be beneficial, but they might cause plants to spread. They might increase the turbidity. So, kind of understanding the issue, what you're trying to solve before throwing them in would be definitely something to consider.
Good. What if it's too clear? What do we do about that?
Yeah, so the most common thing we do is add pond dye, and so you can add different kinds of clay. In aquaculture, it's common to add clay particles when fish are really small, and that kind of blocks their vision. A lot of fish, when they're really small, percids, so walleye and perch are really common for this, will predate each other. They'll eat each other, and so making sure that they can't see each other is important. But doing that on a large scale isn't quite as easy. And so commonly what we want to do is add pond dye. And pond dyes come in a lot of different colors. It's probably something we should spend a whole episode on, because there are a lot of effects on what pond dye can do. But pond dye can decrease the depth that sunlight can pass through the water, right? And so when that happens, we're going to decrease the amount of sunlight hitting the bottom of a pond, and we can then potentially decrease the amount of plants that are growing. Now, remember earlier we chatted about what happens with high turbidity, right? And so if we know that with high turbidity, fish can't feed as well, there's not much research looking at pond dye and whether that same thing happens. And so some researchers think that you need the little particles, the clay particles, to physically block the site. And other researchers think that, if you have enough dye and you can't see in that water, it's effectively doing the same thing. The research, we don't really know, but it seems to make sense that that's at least a concern that we should take into account before we go putting dye into our water.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about it, I would assume that if it can reduce the penetration of sunlight enough that it can reduce plant growth, that ought to be reducing visibility down at some depth at least.
Sure, yeah, and I would think that too. All vision is just light bouncing off of things.
Right.
If you don't have light, it would make sense that you can't see.
Yeah. Yeah.
So definitely something there. Another thing with pond dye is the looks of it, and some people love the looks of it. And black pond dye is becoming a lot more common. It looks more natural than the bright blue color that we tend to associate with pond dye. So there are different colors and there are some benefits, but we don't know for sure what the effects on the fish are. So just something to keep in mind when we're thinking about adding that to our pond.
Definitely. I know from an aesthetic standpoint, I've never liked the look of the blue dye in ponds. I mean, golf courses is the place that I've experienced it the most, and I was actually usually going to those golf course ponds to either fish or to trap muskrats. But I'd go to those, and I didn't like seeing that color out there because it made me just feel like I was fooling around in some kind of unnatural water.
Yeah, that's how I feel too. But perspective is really important, and thinking about the different people listening right here. I meet with a lot of people that think that the water you and I really like is not that pretty, and they would love to see that blue pond. So I think taking home the point there that, hey, if it's your pond and you love that color and you want to put it in there, by all means, go enjoy it. I think that's the big thing. And keep in mind the ecological either benefits or detriments that may come with doing something like adding pond dye to your pond.
Sure. So Joe, you've talked about the water either being too clear or not turbid enough. I mean, what's the big take-home message when we're thinking about water clarity and turbidity?
Yeah, I think the big thing is, think about it, right? And so we're probably trying to attain balance, and that's where that 20 inches of visibility kind of comes into play. We want to make sure we maintain that balance, right? And so that we have some clarity where the fish are able to see certain depths, and we have some growth. We also have some turbidity. So there are phytoplankton floating around, and we don't have excessive plant growth. And so kind of attaining that balance, and really the take-home message that I want people to think about is that clearer isn't always better. And striving for a perfectly clear pond, if you do that, the ecology of your pond is not going to be very happy, and you're going to see population crashes. You're going to see a lot of issues that are unintended. And so just thinking about water quality as a holistic approach, finding a balance where you have the level of clarity where you can enjoy your pond, but also understanding that there are some benefits to some turbidity. I think that's really what I'm trying to drive home here. So attaining balance is what we talk about a lot, and I think that's key.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Well, I'm going to hijack your summary here real quick. And I just got to thinking, you're talking about the clarity and the plant growth and all that kind of stuff. I mean, when I walk up to a pond and I can see it's crystal clear, the only fishing lures I'm going to get out's a plastic worm that I can rig weedless. So if you like fishing weedless plastic worms, because that's the only thing you can throw without getting hung up, then have a clear pond, right?
There you go.
Yeah.
And you might not catch anything because there might be a fish kill, but hey, that's a minor side effect. Right?
All right. Well, Joe, I enjoyed this topic. Thanks for bringing it to us. And all of our listeners, please like, subscribe, share, tweet, retweet, all those sorts of things.
Retweet.
Retweet. Help us get the word out about the podcast if you enjoy it. Thanks for listening, and we will have a terrestrial topic up again in about a couple of weeks.
Fins, Fur, and Feathers is hosted by K-State Research and Extension and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network and this podcast are supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act.